When 55-year-old staff nurse Yvonne Gilford didn't turn up for her shift at 7 a.m. on the 12th of December 1996 at the King Fahd Hospital in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, colleagues thought that maybe she'd overslept, although that seemed unlikely. Yvonne was normally extremely reliable, but sadly that was not the case. What unfolded that morning was not only tragic, brutal and terrifying. The fallout resulted in an international crisis. Hello, I'm Claire, and welcome to Whispers in the Dark. We're looking at a solved murder, one that will leave you questioning what justice even is, and a case where the victim, Yvonne Gilford, is replaced by drama. But today, we're telling Yvonne's story. This is my first case, so welcome to my channel where we uncover true crime cases. I've picked this one because I've got a connection to it, even if it's a distant connection. It's enough to make what happened more real than just headlines in the newspaper. When murder enters a community that you're part of, it's different. Before we start this episode, I just want to tell you, we discuss real crimes involving violence and loss of life. Please take care of yourself if these topics are sensitive to you. Let's start with Yvonne. Yvonne was born in Australia, in the outback, in 1941. She grew up on an absolutely enormous farm in Jamestown, in the outback of Australia. She had an older brother, Frank, and because of the way of life there, they grew up really close, playing with other children on the huge station. After studying nursing and graduating at the age of 28, she started to work internationally, first in New Zealand, then in the UK, South Africa, and finally Saudi Arabia. Colleagues and friends throughout her career described Yvonne as kind-hearted, gentle, helpful, and careful with her money. By the time she was 55, she was starting to fantasize about retiring back home in Australia, where her brother and his wife lived. Yvonne worked at the King Fahd Hospital in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia as a senior staff nurse, along with 100 other expat nurses from all over the world, from Australia, from the UK, South Africa, the Philippines. They lived and worked on the hospital grounds. She was halfway through a one-year contract, and it was an attractive job for nurses with great benefits, so it was easy to see why it attracted Yvonne. They got paid approximately £15,000 tax-free a year, which saved them £3,000 in tax payments, and today that would be an equivalent of £44,000, and again tax-free, so you'd be saving £7,000 on that. It would all go straight into your bank account, plus with free accommodation. So Saudi Arabia, 1996. I was also in Saudi in 1996 and the years before and the years after. And I visited there a lot because my parents were also expats living and working in Dhahran. We didn't know Yvonne personally, but the expat community was tight. And if you didn't know someone, you knew someone who did. So we knew people who knew Yvonne. We knew people who loved Yvonne, and we knew people who knew all about what happened on that night in December 1996. To try to understand what happened and what went down on that night, let's take a trip back to Saudi Arabia and what it was like at the time and what the expat community was also like at the time. I remember my first seconds in Saudi, travelling with my sisters alone on a British Airways flight from Heathrow to Dhahran, 8 hours straight, into a totally different world. Landing in the evening, that moment I stepped off the plane, it was like opening the oven door, that blast of heat so hot it took your breath away. It was bright and loud, and our introduction to Saudi Arabia. Being in the airport felt like peeking behind a very private curtain into a world that was closed to most. Saudi Arabia was a closed country, closed to tourism, a country that didn't really welcome visitors. Visitor visas were really difficult to obtain, and unless you had a specific reason, like work or a religious pilgrimage, there was no chance. I remember being picked up by our parents at the airport and driven through Dhahran at night with the new architecture, listening to prayer times, the heat. It all looked so new and exciting. And then we entered the compounds. It really had a bubble effect. We all lived on compounds, communities of people in the thousands, housed together in groups on the compound. Everybody had a really nice individual Saudi house, a home away from home. Outside the compound was real Saudi, where there were strict rules on how to dress. Men and women were separate, even in restaurants. We'd be seated in the back of the restaurant in the family section, very private, from even other families in the restaurant, whereas the front of the restaurant was reserved for men. Shops would close 6 times a day for about 20 minutes for prayer time, but inside the compounds felt different. It felt like Western culture, and during school holidays it felt like holiday. I would have been in my middle to late teens, and holidays were warm and exciting with endless things to do. Bowling alleys, tennis courts, swimming pools, squash courts, family centres. I learnt to sail at the private beaches, and I even learned to water ski, which was an absolute disaster, but that's another story. We met other families there, we made friends. For us, it was fun. But it also came with a downside. Far away from home and all living together with people you had no real connection with. It was like living in a bubble, away from reality. Gossip and drama was rife, and that was something my mum hated. So she kept a low profile. But also, apart from that, you didn't know who you were living next door to, or who you were working with, and what their background was. There was no reference point, no family members. You could say, actually, it was a great place for people to run and hide. The expat community was mostly made up of teachers like my dad, pilots, doctors, nurses, engineers, and then their families. Then there's the support staff on the compounds, security, maintenance, gardeners, cooks and cleaners, who were also expats, but from different countries, places like India or Pakistan, and they actually had a much harder time in Saudi at the time. They were paid significantly less, and you'd hear stories about their passports being taken off them upon arrival. But somehow we all got on, and kind of with a sense of camaraderie. Everybody was away from home. It was a contained community, separate from being in the actual country, but we enjoyed the trips downtown, where we got to experience some of the country that we were really in. There were luxurious and brilliant shopping malls, vibrant markets, new food to try, all stuff I love. The nursing community actually was really close, and we knew a few of them, so shout out to you guys. They would often socialise together outside of work, and they'd also make trips into town shopping or to the beach. I absolutely remember Coca-Cola Street and Lady Street for awesome shopping, and then there was Dammam Market, which was my favourite. It was a real venture into Saudi Arabia. It was loud and hot and full of 1,000,001 things that you probably didn't need but had to have, haggling bright colours, strong smells, and with wide eyes, I absolutely loved it. December the 11th, 1996, that was a normal day. It started off like any other, and Yvonne finished her shift at 7 p.m. She walked the short walk back to her living quarters, and apparently she'd forgotten her room key. But that was no big problem. She'd left a spare key on the floor above with a friend and colleague, Lucille McLaughlin. They chatted and joked for a while, and Yvonne invited Lucille down to her room for a few drinks and to watch a movie. Lucille accepted. According to Lucille, they watched Terms of Endearment, great film. What happened in that room that evening we may never fully know, but we know this. By her account, when Lucille McLaughlin left sometime between 10:30 and 11, everything was fine. Yvonne was alive and nothing was wrong. Next morning, the shift starts at 7 a.m, and Yvonne was supposed to be there. She didn't show up. At 7:20, a supervisor, concerned and thinking she'd overslept, something she'd actually never done before, she went to raise her out of her room, and she knocked on the door, but the room was silent. Concern grew. and the whereabouts of Yvonne. The compound management and security are called. Eventually, when they get inside of the room, they find blood. A lot of blood. And they find Yvonne Gilford's lifeless body brutalised. There are signs of a struggle throughout the room, and the room is in complete disarray. Signs of violence and a fight clearly took place. Yvonne's body was lying on the floor covered in blood. She was pronounced dead at the scene at 10 a.m. The attack that Yvonne had suffered wasn't quick. It was sustained and brutal. The autopsy would later reveal exactly what Yvonne had suffered. She was stabbed more than 10 times across her body, with one deep stab wound on the left side of her back, so deep that it entered her chest and into her heart, and another stab wound on the right side of her chest, where the knife had actually gone in and been taken partially out before being pushed deeper and entering her lung, and there was a third stab wound to her lower torso that had damaged her liver and spleen, and her head was bashed in by a kettle. Finally, she'd been suffocated with her own pillow. It was a prolonged and vicious attack that happened sometime in the early hours of the morning. Yvonne had suffered. This took time and strength. And the final cause of death was revealed to actually be asphyxiation with her own pillow being held over her face. Shock waves rippled through the community fast. How could such a thing happen here to such a well-respected, beloved friend and colleague? No one had a bad word to say about Yvonne, and it was genuinely scary. Did someone come into the nursing compound to do this? Was it a sexual attack? Was this done by someone in our community or someone else? Was it a colleague? Was it a security guard? Was this in-house? Is there a monster among us? Immediately, when the body was discovered, outside of her room, friends and colleagues gathered as the horror unfolded. Shock and fear spread among them. Among them was her friend Lucille, who at this point was in full panic and was heard to be shouting over and over again, asking for answers. Is her friend dead? What's happened? She made no secret that she'd actually been with Yvonne the night before and she was alive and well. And the investigation starts as everybody in the hospital gets questioned by the Saudi police. One of the first things they did is physically examine the relevant people's hands and necks, looking for signs of a fight. Police summarised that the scene was so violent that the perpetrator must have been left with scratches, bruises or gouges during such a sustained attack. Yvonne must have fought back. At this point, colleagues notice Deborah Parry, another one of Yvonne's friends and a colleague, feeling uncomfortable and looking stressed. She told a witness, one of her other colleagues, that she was concerned that she would look guilty because her cat Purdy had scratched her arms and feet the night before when they were playing. She did have a cat, of course, but the colleague replied to her that the police could probably tell the difference between cat scratches and human scratches. She remembered the incident later, and she stated that some part of her brain accepted Deborah's story, but the other part of her brain accepted that something was off. A few of the nurses were actually taken to the police station for further questioning. From the outset of the investigation, 2 names came forward: Lucille McLaughlin, her friend, and Deborah Parry, another friend. It was rumoured that the 3 women were in a complicated love triangle, and when questioned about it, both women denied this was the case. However, speculation was rife. Honestly, I heard this also afterwards as well. People were talking about motive, a crime of passion. That was the vibe at the time. This was really just gossip and rumours, and they were initially denied. There was also no evidence to corroborate this. Years later, when asked about it, Lucille McLaughlin's answers would become more ambiguous. By 6 p.m, both women had been taken to the police station in Dhahran again, and to be fair, other nurses were also questioned, more to verify what happened the day before Yvonne died. No one was arrested immediately. The police were just gathering evidence. That was Friday. And over the next couple of days, the hospital and the compound and the living quarters were on lockdown, meaning nobody could leave site. But by Monday, the 15th of December, 4 days after the murder, routine at the hospital was returning. Life was getting back to normal. Access out of the hospital was allowed again. After work on Monday, Lucille, Deborah and another colleague called Caroline went downtown to do some banking at the Arab National Bank in downtown Dhahran. Caroline witnessed Lucille using the cash point and then going to a bank teller to wire cash back to her UK bank account, something that actually wasn't unusual for people to do back then. Then they went shopping and for some food. After eating, Lucille wanted to go to the cash point again. She said she'd wired too much money home and she needed some cash for the week. Following day, Tuesday the 16th, Deborah Parry and Lucille McLaughlin went back out into town banking again. They went to the cash point and Lucille again wired money back home. Actually, there was paper evidence of this at the bank. Another standout fact on this day: Deborah went to get her hair drastically cut at a hairdresser in the community, a wife whose husband worked there. She ran a little salon out of her spare room in her house. She stated that Deborah came in to get a haircut, but as the hairdresser started cutting, she noticed bald patches on Deborah's head. She asked what on earth happened. They weren't there last time she was there, and Deborah replied that she'd been trying to thin out her bushy hair, but it didn't work, hence coming to the hairdressers. But the hairdresser stated that these were severe bald patches, as if someone had actually pulled the hair out rather than cut the hair away in an attempt to try and thin out bushy hair. So the hairdresser herself actually noted and remembered this was weird and it felt wrong. Then the following day, on Thursday, a full week after the murder, again Lucille and Deborah went downtown, again to do some more banking, and again to send money back home. She later said that this money came from her stash that she'd accumulated. So the money that she was sending home actually had come from her own room. It was a stash that she'd brought with her to Saudi in case of emergencies. Actually, it was during this transaction in the bank that both ladies were arrested. But not for murder, for theft. Since the murder, police had been monitoring Yvonne's bank account and had noticed activity after her murder. They'd therefore put her account under surveillance, and because of the alleged love triangle between the three of them, Yvonne, Deborah and Lucille, they'd actually also put Deborah and Lucille under surveillance. And then the story really unfolded. So let's go back to Monday the 15th, the day that the compound opened up. Yvonne's bank account and cash card had been used. Cash was taken out at roughly the same time that Lucille had wired money back to her Dundee bank account, and the amounts were the same. Lucille maintains that she was cashing her work cheque. Later in the evening, when she'd been shopping and then for food, and she'd said that she needed more cash for the week, Yvonne's bank card had 3 attempts to withdraw cash in reducing amounts. But the request had been denied because Yvonne's bank had exceeded its daily limit. And then on the Thursday, at the time of Lucille and Deborah's arrest, Yvonne's account had another withdrawal from the same bank that they were arrested in. And the bank manager handed over to the police a half-filled-out transaction form with Lucille's handwriting and her name on it, and a request to transfer funds back to her Dundee bank account for the same amount that was taken out of Yvonne's bank account. Upon arrest, in Lucille's black handbag, there was the equivalent of £2,000 in cash and Yvonne's bank card. Now, that seems like a lot of circumstantial evidence, but to this, Lucille claims that she actually transferred money to her bank account. It came from her cheque and it came from her cash. It seems like a lot of circumstantial evidence, right? But to this, Lucille claims that the transfers to the bank account were normal and innocent. One was her wages and one was her emergency money stash. She felt she needed to send her stash back home because obviously someone is going round killing people and stealing their money, and she thought it would be safer that way. Later on, during questioning, both women actually confessed to the theft. They confessed to stealing from Yvonne. Lucille stated that 3 days after the murder, Deborah had told her that she had Yvonne's bank account, and they decided to take some money because basically Yvonne didn't need it anymore. But they maintained they had nothing to do with her death. But the dam had broken. Gradually, over the next days, both women confessed to the murder of Yvonne Gilford. First Lucille, and then Deborah. Initially, their confessions didn't really line up. Lucille seemed to always lead the way in the discussions, stating that she'd actually been called to mediate in an argument between Yvonne and Deborah about their relationship. It had got violent. Deborah had struck Yvonne, and the attack had started. Lucille only helped clean up once Yvonne was dead. And her main crime was actually taking the bank card. Deborah actually admitted to stabbing Yvonne. Then, after some days in Saudi prison, their accounts changed. They made another statement, this time much more in line with each other. Deborah attacked Yvonne, struck her with an iron, stabbed her multiple times, and Lucille, almost as an act of mercy or kindness, smothered her, she said, to put her out of her misery. So, it seems case closed, right? On December the 23rd, both Lucille McLaughlin and Deborah Parry stood before a Saudi judge and made their full confession. They had local legal counselling, and it was at this time that the embassy got involved with both nurses. The legal system was explained to them, and they came to realise exactly the amount of trouble that they were in, and it was a lot. Pretty much the most trouble you can get in legally anywhere in the world. Saudi Arabia is a country that exercises capital punishment, an eye for an eye. That's their belief, and the punishment for murder is death. It's extremely well known by all expats. Corporal punishment there comes in different forms to what we're normally used to. Stealing can result in your hand being cut off. Other crimes can carry sentences such as whippings, and the worst of crimes, murder, carries a death sentence, decapitation by sword. These punishments are meted out publicly in the town square, and crowds gather, and they're encouraged to witness this. Expats often refer to the public executions and the place that it happens as Chop Square, and they avoid this spectacle by not going into town on those days. To give you an idea about the numbers, in 1998 it was reported that 109 people were executed in this way, although since then that number's actually significantly increased. Most of these beheadings were actually foreign nationals, countries like Pakistan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, with most of those being male, and the few women that were executed were domestic workers. Over the next days, both women started to change their story again, and eventually, on the 28th of December, both women informed Tim Lamb, their representative at the British consulate, that they wished to retract their confessions, that they were in fact innocent of all the alleged crimes, and they'd only confessed because the Saudi police had coerced them into it. They stated that they were intimidated, they were deprived of sleep. Lucille claims that she was denied bathroom visits on the night of her arrest, and actually she couldn't hold it anymore and she'd peed herself. She was then told to strip naked from the waist down. She said she was groped and she was terrified, and she felt extremely sexually intimidated and humiliated. Deborah Parry claims that the police were threatening to burn her eyes with a cigarette, and that's why they signed the confessions. Both women claim that the police promised them that they would be deported home, that no one at home knew of the crime, and they would just return to their normal lives. They also claim that they were told what to write by the police. When asked by their lawyer and by the consulate why they were only hearing of this now 1 week after their arrests, Lucille replied that she was unsure about who she could trust. John Ware, who was actually an investigative journalist at the time who worked on the case for over 2 years, concluded that Debbie, he thought, was actually innocent. His angle was that Lucille at the time of her arrest saw an opportunity, confessed to get the upper hand and to manage the narrative of the story. She knew she'd been caught with the bank cards and that was bad. She knew she was in a world of trouble, and to shift the blame, she confessed first. It wasn't until 3 days later, after Lucille's confession, that Deborah actually also confessed. Deborah was almost fitted up for the crime, according to John Ware, while Lucille was much more in the background despite her having her bank account details and her bank card and all of the other circumstantial evidence. At the time of their arrest, although there was speculation and gossip that they were guilty, very quickly the British press, and as a result the country as a whole, felt sympathy for the accused nurses facing imprisonment and extreme corporal punishment for a crime based only on circumstantial evidence and a coerced confession. So far from home and so far from what they know. Because the narrative that emerged in the press very soon were poor British nurses facing beheading in Saudi Arabia. Before we go further, we actually need to understand who these two women were. Lucille McLaughlin was a 33-year-old Scottish nurse from Dundee. She'd come to Saudi Arabia to escape something. She'd been fired from her nursing job in Scotland for gross misconduct. Specifically, she'd stolen £2,800 from a 79-year-old patient in her care by taking her bank card and going to the cash point. And this is while she worked at King's Cross Hospital in Dundee. It was a theft conviction, and she'd fled to Saudi to escape the consequences, to make a fresh start, to disappear into the expat bubble where no one really asked questions about your past. She'd been working at the hospital only 6 weeks at the time of the murder. Now, what emerges after Yvonne's death is troubling. McLaughlin had a history of that exact crime, theft, of using someone else's bank card and of taking money that wasn't hers. She also had a key to Yvonne's room, not in a suspicious way. It was a safety measure for Yvonne if she ever forgot her key. Now, don't forget there was also no forced entry into Yvonne's bedroom. Deborah Parry was an English nurse from Hampshire. Now, she'd come to Saudi also 6 weeks earlier for different reasons, and she was running away from personal tragedy. Her 16-year-old brother had been killed in a motorcycle accident. Weeks later, her mum had drowned. And years before that, her father had died of a heart attack. Her brother-in-law died of a brain hemorrhage. Deborah Parry spent years in psychiatric counselling, convinced that she was jinxed. That tragedy followed her. And she came to Saudi, hoping for a fresh start, and a place where none of that pain existed. Colleagues actually noticed, with hindsight, that leading up to the murder, Deborah was struggling with some kind of psychiatric issue. She seemed very down, very anxious, and they were concerned about her. But they never ever imagined that anything like this would happen. But in that pressure cooker of the compound, in that intense, isolated world, something went wrong, or something escalated, or something had been building that came to a head, and Yvonne had died. What emerges as the case develops is circumstantial. Yeah, but it's damning. The bank card, with thousands of unauthorised withdrawals from Yvonne's bank account after her death, also witnessed by the colleague, also backed up by paper evidence from the banks. The key to Yvonne's bedroom, Lucille had that. Lucille also had a history of credit card theft, Same crime, right? Now appeared in Saudi Arabia. Then there's Deborah with odd behaviours immediately after the murder. A colleague, Rosemary, described her as being very erratic that week, waving her arms around in the hospital passages, asking nurses, "What should I say when the police question me?" Deborah was also covered in the scratches that she claims came from her cat Purdy. They were on her hands and feet, and then there was also the hair, bald patches on her head. Now, in Saudi, the most damning, the confessions. And the confessions that they gave actually matched Yvonne's injuries in the autopsy. Now, the police could have been criticised for having blinkers on and railroading the investigation without exploring other possibilities. There were other theories. People speculated, and the police did look into it, but they were dismissed as they led nowhere really. Some suggested compound guards, specifically security guards that were involved in a loan sharking operation. They theorised that Yvonne, generous with her money and loaning to people and friends, were actually interfering with the guards' lucrative side hustle, so they killed her. Now, to back up this theory, some guards actually did disappear after Yvonne's murder. And the British press jumped on this. One article, and I found quotes, stated that Yvonne used Filipino martial arts experts to enforce widespread loan sharking activity, stating that it had become clear that other people could have been involved in her murder. The pictures released by Yvonne's family after her murder made her look so angelic. In fact, the 55-year-old Australian nurse had a fearsome reputation as a brutal loan shark who hired heavies to beat loan repayments out of their victim. A different quote stated, "No one was surprised that Yvonne had in fact been murdered. I think most people expected it to happen long before this." There's also mention of another nurse at the same hospital that died 2 years earlier, a lady called Liberty de Guzman in 1994, also killed at the King Fahd Hospital. She was found in her room, murdered, in what some people described as similar circumstances. She'd been beaten, strangled, stabbed, and left for dead. Her husband was convicted of her murder and sentenced, but he'd been found dead in his prison cell, having committed suicide by repeatedly bashing his head on the sink in his cell. However, obviously, this was also unconnected. So the months rolled on, and it became apparent that things in the Saudi legal system were different to what people back home were used to. In Saudi, each case hangs on the confession, regardless of physical evidence. It's all about the confession, and this is a religious basis. The focus is confession, repent, forgive. As you may have noticed, we haven't even touched on any physical evidence that was found at the scene, or how it was processed at the time. Fingerprints, blood splatter, footprints, DNA, which was actually around at the time, not as advanced as it is today, but available. I haven't even mentioned that, because we don't know anything about it. Number one, Saudi's very secretive about the evidence that they did have, and in their legal system, it's actually irrelevant. It's all about the confession. Both ladies were detained in the ladies' prison in Dhahran, and it was in May that the trial started. Upholding the nurses' confessions, it was extremely closed door and private. I'll say it again. Zero physical evidence. From Yvonne's body, from the room. Actually, no evidence was even presented in court, we don't think, about the bank transactions. All of that is irrelevant. It only hinged on the confession. And so therefore the trial was actually really short. Guilty. And the verdict comes down. Deborah Parry is found guilty of intentional murder, and she is sentenced to death by sword, under Islamic law, specifically the diha, a system of compensation. That death sentence can only be commuted to imprisonment if Yvonne's closest surviving relative accepts blood money as compensation for Yvonne's death. Lucille McLaughlin is found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in prison and 500 lashes. And the women returned to prison to await their punishment. But it wasn't a quiet wait. There was an international shitstorm brewing. Frank Gilford, Yvonne's brother, holds his sister's killer's life in his hands. If he accepts blood money, Deborah Parry's sentence is commuted. If he refuses, she faces execution, public beheading by sword. Initially, Yvonne's brother wanted this sentence carried out to its fullest, far away from where his beloved sister had lost her life. Hearing everything only via telephone, he heard the exact details of her death and what Yvonne had suffered. And honestly, when that's your family member, your only family member, you can only imagine what that would feel like. But it makes me think of words like punishment, justice, or even revenge. Newspapers in both countries, England and Australia, ran headlines like, "Save our nurses from beheading." But it's not just the newspapers or the public outcry. Imagining 2 British nationals being beheaded publicly in Saudi Arabia, both Australian and British embassies and consulates got involved heavily. John Major, the British Prime Minister at the time, also got involved. The New York Times headline ran with, "Nurse murder throws Britain and Saudi Arabia into crisis." And this was no exaggeration. The British and Saudi economies were vital to each other at the time, and they'd had a great working relationship. What would the optics look like if this sentence was carried out publicly? Amnesty International even got involved, publishing a paper quoting, "Resorting to human rights violations is no way to mete out justice. Executions amount to the ultimate violation to the right to life, and flogging is nothing short of a cruel and inhumane treatment." The Saudi legal system, which is based on the Sharia law, was also slammed in the press for its human rights flaws, not only for capital punishment, for it being public as well, but also because of the pressure it put on the victim's family, that they hold the law in their hands. While the Saudi government asserted a different framework of rights, claiming that the imposition and pressure of Western culture values undermine their cultural and religious identity. That became the narrative. And Yvonne was gone, lost in this political sound wall. Her death, the brutal murder, everything she went through and suffered, almost became irrelevant, gone from the story. Even Deborah and Lucille were somehow gone from the story. It was now a much wider story, political, religious, economic. So Frank wanted to uphold the sentence. For him, it was about his sister, her terrible waste and loss of life for nothing. The pain she'd gone through and the suffering. He didn't want money. He just wanted justice. Justice for Yvonne, for her life taken so brutally. Not revenge. It was his little sister. So Frank and his wife in Jamestown were inundated by press camping outside their homes, blocking the street. They only wanted to know one thing. Will he uphold the death sentence? Are we really going to go and see this play out on the world stage? So in September 1997, in a secret meeting held away from the press, away from the Saudi government, with Frank and the nurse's Saudi lawyer and Australian envoys, they had a meeting and they were searching for a solution that would somehow give everybody what they wanted. For Frank, justice for his sister. For the UK, to spare the nurses' lives. They could do this by looking at the Saudi law, which they had to abide to because that's where the crime happened, and commuting the death sentence and commuting the whipping, and turn that into some jail time and blood money. Compensation. The British deemed it important that they put a financial package together. The nurses didn't have any kind of huge amounts of money. So with the help of the government and from companies with Saudi interests, they raised £750,000. 3 weeks later, Frank held a press conference near his home in Australia where he accepted £750,000 compensation for the death of his sister. Now, rather than pocket that large sum of money, Frank honours the memory of his sister by donating it to a women and children's hospital in Brisbane, Australia, where Yvonne grew up. Now, this is the most humane thing that comes out of this entire story, but it's also the saddest. That's the only way Yvonne gets remembered, gets honoured. It's through money raised to save the lives of her killers. However, that's not really the end of the drama. The press vilified him instantly. For months, he was inundated by requests from that same press. Rather than wanting his sister's death linked to a political uproar and a public international execution, he just wanted to remember his sister and honour her life and grieve for her death. Now, he was accused of accepting blood money. Tabloids called him greedy, saying that he'd profited from his sister's murder. This in itself stirred up some tension between Anglo and Australian relationships. Frank, having given in and given the UK government what they wanted, but within the Saudi law, felt unappreciated, and again the memory of his sister was swept aside. Now, 2 years pass. Both women imprisoned in Saudi jail. And then, in 1998, just 17 months after their arrest, King Fahd commutes both sentences. Both women are released and deported. They're basically sent home. And they both return to the UK. And they sell their stories to the tabloids. For money, for a lot of money, to the tune of £100,000 each, and today that would be the equivalent of £250,000 each. They appeared on Panorama, they appeared on Breakfast TV, they were celebrities. Deborah Parry, Lucille McLaughlin, the poor British nurses who'd survived Saudi prison. People sympathised, and they were portrayed as victims of this brutal justice system. Hundreds of thousands of pounds flowed from tabloid deals, book deals, interview fees, money from their notoriety, money from being accused in a murder case. Meanwhile, Yvonne Gilford isn't even mentioned anymore. Her murder seems to be forgotten. If Yvonne and Lucille were not her killers, then who was? There was no mention of that. When the press interest slows down and the drama dies down, Deborah Parry resumes her nursing career. Despite attempts by MP George Galloway to have her struck off the register, she gets re-employed at the hospital near her home. Life goes on. She maintains her innocence, continues to insist that she had nothing to do with Yvonne's death. She upholds her accusations of mistreatment at the hands of the Saudi legal system, but slowly the noise quietens and her life resumes. Lucille returns to her life as if this trip to Saudi had never happened. That means facing her original charge of stealing the bank card from the elderly patient at King's Cross Hospital in Dundee. Plus, now, also accused, forging her references that allowed her to get the job in Saudi Arabia anyway. Time for her to face the music. But she pleads not guilty. She's found guilty of committing fraud and forging her references. Her defence lawyer, John Boyle, at sentencing, stated that the events in Saudi Arabia had left an indelible mark on her. And her sentence? She received maximum community service, 240 hours, and £300 compensation. And she was struck off the nursing register. She published a book in 1998 with the help of a co-writer documenting her time in a Saudi jail. She got married And life rolled on. She had a new name. She was no longer Lucille McLaughlin. She was now Lucy Ferry. And then in July 2014, Lucille suffered a massive brain hemorrhage at her home in Scotland. She was rushed to hospital, and her family made the decision to eventually switch off her life support machine, and she dies at the age of 48 in her home country, surrounded by her family and loved ones. Her solicitor later stated that she was mentally scarred by her experiences, that the trauma of the prison, of the trial, of the confession, real or coerced, had left her permanently damaged. Meanwhile, Deborah Parry continues a nursing career, and actually there's little more known about her life after that. The victim has completely disappeared, and that's the sad thing about this case. Yvonne Gilford lost her life brutally. Her reputation as a kind, helpful, caring nurse was also destroyed and ruined, and she was labelled a violent and brutal moneylender. And all of that got lost in the drama. She was murdered. Probably over a lover's tiff. Should say allegedly over a lover's tiff. Was it a crime of passion? Was it to get access to her money? Now, also a question I want to know, what would the physical evidence at the scene have shown about Yvonne's last moments? I think there'll always be questions, but the case for me still stands out as a really rough case. The justice that was served doesn't feel right. In the light of zero physical evidence, their convictions will somehow always have question marks above them, and the accusations of prison brutality muddy the waters further. Another question. Is it really punishment, the blood money, if a third party pays? So the British government and companies with interests in Saudi Arabia paid Frank the blood money. So actually, the punishment wasn't felt by the people that were accused of the crime. This is also why Yvonne's story matters. Now, because of the machinery of justice, of the trials and the sentencing and the commutations and the tabloid narrative, she's the person that gets lost. Now, because of the machinery of justice in the trials and the sentences and the commutations, but because of the machinery of justice and the drama that happened after the event, everything that played out in the tabloids, one person gets hugely lost in this. Yvonne Gilford was a nurse, a caregiver, a generous woman who helped people, and she died violently at the age of 55 years old, just 4 days from her 56th birthday. And that's actually what this story is about. Not the drama of the trial, not the poor British nurses, not the international incident, but Yvonne, who she was, how she died, and why she matters. And she was more than a victim in a sensational case. She was a person, and she deserves to be remembered. That's all from me. Thank you for walking this path, and thank you for remembering Yvonne Gilford.